Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. It is week 7 of the fantasy show. Another week, another disappointing outing for myself in fantasy football. Hopefully, not for you guys as well. Hopefully, you guys are doing just fine. Hopefully, you had some of those top players have some big weeks for you. Hopefully, you picked right, and you're well on your way to making that fantasy championship playoff run. So for week 6, had some names on here that we've been waiting for them to have big games. Other names that you expected to perform big because of how they've been playing so far this year, and it just didn't happen. So let's hop right in to the fantasy heroes, villains, and good Samaritans. But first, let's talk about injuries and buys this upcoming week. Your buys are going to be Buffalo, Philly, Minnesota, and the LA Rams. So no Josh Allen, no Stephon Diggs, no Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, Miles Sanders, no Justin Jefferson, Kirk Cousins, no Cooper Kupp. So a lot of big hitters going to be out this week. So we're going to see how fantasy teams that have been kind of relying on those guys actually perform this week, so it'll be interesting to see. Injuries, you've got Marquise Brown went out with a foot injury, left the game with a walking boot, so that is not good for him. Not a good look. The Cardinals now have brought in Robbie Anderson, traded from the Panthers almost immediately after his kerfuffle with the Carolina coach. So Marquise Brown, if you were counting on him throughout the first few weeks, I'm going to say he probably won't be in for a good extended amount of time. Randall Cobb had an ankle injury. Kendrick Bourne had a toe injury. And Kenny Pickett, who's been playing pretty well in his first couple starts against tough teams, got a concussion, so probably won't be in next week. Gonna have to wait and see how the concussion protocol works out for him. Players that should be back this week: Dak Prescott is expected to be back after his thumb injury. DeAndre Hopkins, his suspension is finally up, so he will be in this week. DeAndre Swift should be back from a shoulder, ankle, from his plethora of injuries. He should be back. Chris Olave didn't play last week because of a concussion. He should be back this week. Tua has been out. Obviously, we know that story with the whole concussion deal. He should be back this week. And as I said, Robbie Anderson traded to the Cardinals. Don't know if it's going to mean much for fantasy, but he will probably look to take that second wide receiver role behind DeAndre Hopkins. So now let's hop into the heroes, villains, and good Samaritans. At the quarterback position, finally, we've been waiting for it. Joe Burrow got the number 1 quarterback spot. He had 300 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 25 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground. 4 total touchdowns, giving him 32.5 fantasy points. And how about quarterback number 2? Matt Ryan, 389 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, had -4 rushing yards for 27.16 fantasy points. This is kind of what Colts fans, I imagine, wanted to happen with Matt Ryan coming in, near 400-yard passing games. Finally got one. Does it continue? I don't know. I don't think so. That's not how the first however many games went. It's been tough sledding for the Colts, but they did it against Jacksonville, so possibly they continue to play that way, and Matt Ryan will consistently be back up in the top 10 at least every week. Villains at the quarterback position: Zach Wilson, 110 passing yards and 1 rushing touchdown, only 4.5 points, and his team scored 35 points. How's your team putting up points, but you as a fantasy quarterback are not? Absolutely annoying. I've got him in 2 different leagues, and it's not working out. And then Justin Herbert, how about this? He played a tough defense, but only had 238 passing yards, threw an interception, and only had 9 rushing yards for 8.42 fantasy points. As one of the top quarterbacks drafted, you definitely never want to see Justin Herbert in this list. Hopefully it's a bounce back next week, because this week it was a tough game against a tough Broncos defense. They still pulled out the win though, so it doesn't help you anything for fantasy, but at least he did enough to pull out the win with the Chargers. Then our good Samaritans, we're going to look at the quarterback 4 and 5. How about Marcus Mariota getting up there into that top 5? Only had 129 passing yards, but had 2 touchdowns through the air, 50 yards on the ground, and a touchdown on the ground as well for 24.16 fantasy points. I doubt anybody started Marcus Mariota this week, but if you did, you were a lot happier than most people, because quarterback 5 performance, pretty dang good for him. And then Trevor Lawrence in the losing effort, he at least didn't turn the ball over this week. He had 165 passing yards and a touchdown through the air, 23 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground, giving him 24.9 fantasy points, giving him the quarterback 4 finish. So again, they didn't win, but if you're starting Trevor Lawrence, you were happy that there wasn't turnovers this week. You were happy that there was 3 touchdowns on the board, and he gave you a solid top 5 performance. At the running back position, Deion Jackson. Ooh! Deion Jackson is your hero, one of your hero running backs. He had 42 rushing yards and a touchdown, but really got involved through the air with 10 catches for 79 yards for 28.1 fantasy points. Again, he's one of the backups, one of the many backups in the Colts offense, and he got it done this week, especially through the air. So if any of the backs are to miss more time, he might be a valuable streaming option. And then Ramondre Stevenson, he had 76 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 4 catches for 15 yards. He had 25.1 fantasy points. Dylan and I have talked about him quite a bit. I've talked about him quite a bit as well. An absolute monster of a running back, giving you these consistent top games every week. Even with when Damian Harris was in, he was still giving you a solid week. I think he's solidifying himself as that top guy, and you can expect more of these performances. For your villains, you had Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's been a model of consistency so far this year. Only get 3.3 fantasy points with just 33 rushing yards. And then Aaron Jones in the second upset game that Green Bay has given up in 2 weeks. 19 rush yards, only 3 catches for 25 yards, 7.4 fantasy points. What's going on with Green Bay? What's going on with their fantasy output, especially at the running back position with Aaron Jones? Wasn't there, and definitely you probably started him thinking, okay, the Jets should be a good matchup, at least for Aaron Jones. It wasn't, and it was a tough day. Good Samaritans. How about Kenyon Drake giving you 119 rush yards with a touchdown with 1 catch for 8 yards. He had 19.7 fantasy points. Who does he even play for anymore? The Baltimore Ravens. That's who. I believe J.K. Dobbins sustained some sort of injury throughout the game. Kenyon Drake came in, gave you a running back 7 performance. So not too bad if you were streaming Kenyon Drake. And then a guy that I was touting last week, pretty excited about him, Kenneth Walker had 97 rush yards and a touchdown with 2 catches for 13 yards. He was the running back 8 with 19 points. So especially if you were a Rashad Penny person and you got Kenneth Walker to back him up and you plugged him in this week, definitely a good payoff for you there. You were not disappointed. Then at the wide receiver position, again, we were waiting on Joe Burrow to have a big game. Ja'Marr Chase finally has his first big game since week 1. 7 catches, 132 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 32.2 fantasy points. And then Stephon Diggs, shocker, up here in the top. 10 catches, 148 yards, and a touchdown for 30.8 fantasy points. And remember, he's not going to be in this week, so you're going to have to find something different to do because he has a bye with the rest of Buffalo. At your villains for the wide receiver position, DK Metcalf put up a stinker for you. 2 catches, 34 yards, only 5.4 fantasy points. And then Mike Evans. It was a mediocre game, but if you're getting less than 10 out of your wide receivers, you're not happy. He only had 4 catches for 42 yards, 8.2 fantasy points. Is this going to continue to be a trend? We'll talk about it a little later, but it's always tough when you have a guy like Mike Evans who's supposed to be really good, really consistent, and get you under 10 points. Then your Good Samaritan wide receivers, you had Brandon Ayuk get 8 catches for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns, putting up a wide receiver 4 performance with 28.3 fantasy points. And then Chase Claypool, big week for him, 7 catches, 96 yards and a touchdown, also had 8 rushing yards, put up 23.4 for the wide receiver 6 spot. If Kenny Pickett is also out this week, Chase Claypool could be somebody that you look at to play because Mitch Trubisky likes Chase Claypool. We saw that while he was starting. We saw a shift when Kenny Pickett came in to George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth. If it's not Kenny Pickett, Chase Claypool could be a good option next week. Then at the tight end position, Mike Gesicki was sitting on my bench and put up a tight end 1 performance. He had 6 catches, 69 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 24.9 fantasy points. And then shocker, you had Mark Andrews at the tight end 2 position. Just for reference, Travis Kelce was number 3. But Mark Andrews had 7 catches, 106 yards, and a touchdown for 23.6 fantasy points. You're not going to get away from Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews being in the top 3 most of the time, and it wasn't any different this week. At your villain spot for the tight ends, you had Dallas Goedert only get 2 catches for 22 yards and 4.2 fantasy points. He's been a pretty consistent tight end, I think scoring about 10 points a game. So 4.2 definitely isn't what you wanted. And then Taysom Hill had that huge tight end week last week, or the week before. This week, he didn't have much. 39 rushing yards, 16 passing yards for 4.54 fantasy points. It's like I talked about with Dylan on his show, I believe. Do you trust Taysom Hill? Do you keep him in? You almost have to, because you've got the plethora of other tight ends that don't get you much and don't have the boom potential of Taysom Hill, but you also risk having weeks like this where he only gets 4.5 fantasy points. Then at the Good Samaritan position for tight ends, you had Robert Tonyan. Finally, I've been waiting for this because I thought, he's the one consistent target that Aaron Rodgers has. He's got to get in the mix. He finally did. 10 catches for 90 yards, put up 19 points, and was the tight end for this past week. And then George Kittle finally maybe finding his stride with Jimmy Garoppolo. 8 catches, 83 yards. He put up 16.3 fantasy points and gave you the tight end 5 performance. Now let's get into the starts and sits going into week 7. Let's hop right into it. A couple quarterbacks, couple running backs, couple receivers, and the tight end on both lists. Let's start out with the starting quarterbacks, Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert. Burrow is against Atlanta, which is 22nd against fantasy quarterbacks. Burrow's coming off that quarterback 1 performance, 32 points. Atlanta, they give up 21.1 on average to quarterbacks, and they have allowed 20 points or more in every single game except for 1. So I really like Joe Burrow this week, coming off a big week, going into a game against Atlanta where it's a great matchup. I think that spells trouble for Atlanta, spells good news for your fantasy team. I think he's going to be fantastic this week. And Justin Herbert, I think it's going to be a bounce back week after that down week in Denver because he's going up against Seattle, who is 23rd against fantasy quarterbacks. He's coming off of 2 back-to-back down performances, but Seattle, they give up 20.6 fantasy points to quarterbacks. And on average, they give up about 250 through the air and a touchdown. I think Justin Herbert, last week was tough. The week before was tough. Now he's got a good matchup against a team who, historically this year, gives up a lot of points. has shootout games. A lot of points are being scored, and we've seen quite a few top fantasy performers come from a Seattle Seahawks game. So I think that's going to be the way it goes this week, and I think Justin Herbert bounces back. Who are we sitting at the quarterback position? Trevor Lawrence and Jared Goff. Jared Goff is going up against Dallas, who is 6th against fantasy quarterbacks. Dallas has 5 interceptions in 6 weeks. So you never want your fantasy quarterback to turn the ball over. Dallas forces a lot of turnovers, so 5 interceptions in 6 weeks makes it a tough play. And they've only they give up only just over 200 yards passing and 14 points to quarterbacks. It's going to be tough. They're coming off of a bye. Dallas is coming off of a pretty close loss, and they're finally getting Dak Prescott back. So I think it's going to be really, really tough sledding for Detroit this week, and inherently Jared Goff. And then Trevor Lawrence, he's going up against the Giants, who are 10th against quarterbacks. They only allow about 16 points to that position. They only allow 18 completions, just over 200 yards. And in 3 weeks, they've given up less than 50% completion percentage. Trevor Lawrence just finally had that kind of bounce back game, but we've seen it from the Giants that they're not a slouch of a team. They shut down Aaron Rodgers the week before. They did a pretty good job against Lamar Jackson in that win this past week. So I think Trevor Lawrence, especially of those 3 quarterbacks, is the lower end, and I think it's going to be a tough week for him going up against the Giants. At the running back position, who are we starting? We're starting Josh Jacobs and Ramondre Stevenson. Josh Jacobs is going against Houston, who's 31st against fantasy running backs. Pair that with Josh Jacobs coming off of a bye, so he's rested. And before that, he had back-to-back 30-point games. And in his last 2 games, he's got over 100 rushing yards, a touchdown, and 5 catches. Houston, they give up 24.2 fantasy points and 133 rushing yards to the running back position. I think Josh Jacobs, he continues his momentum. Is it going to be another 30-point game? Probably not, but a very good chance it could be. So I think Josh Jacobs is a smash play this week. And then Ramondre Stevenson, coming off his running back 2 performance, is going up against Chicago, who is 23rd against the running back. In the past 2 weeks, Stevenson's had big games. The running back 14 week with 19.5 points, and then last week, the 25-point performance gave him the running back 2 day. And Chicago, they like to give up points to running backs. They've given up 3 top 10 fantasy performances this year. So Ramondre Stevenson, I think they're going to have to lean on him, especially if it's, again, Bailey Zappi, who Bailey Zappi did pretty good last week. But if it is still Bailey Zappi, they're really going to have to lean on Ramondre Stevenson the way they have been. Even if it's Mac Jones, they're still going to lean on him. So I think he becomes top 10 number 4 against the Chicago defense, and I think it's a great play this week. Who are we sitting at the running back position? Christian McCaffrey and David Montgomery. Yes, I said sit Christian McCaffrey. He's going up against Tampa Bay, who is 2nd against the running back position. They only give up about 12 points to running backs per game. They've given less than 100 yards and 3. They give less than 100 yards and 3 receptions to running backs, which that's most of Christian McCaffrey right there, is receiving the football, getting 100 yards total. So going to be tough sledding for him. And I do know that McCaffrey's had 3 straight 20-point games. I think that breaks this week against Tampa, who is a solid defense. And how are these trade talks going to affect the way that Christian McCaffrey plays? Panthers, I think, are going full rebuild mode. They just fired their head coach. They're talking openly with other teams about trading Christian McCaffrey. So it'll be interesting to see if he lands anywhere before the trade deadline. But how is that going to affect his play? I think it definitely does not help morale, especially going up against Tampa Bay. David Montgomery, he's going up against New England, who is 5th against the running back position. And Montgomery has only had 2 games over 10 points. We're in week 6. I believe he didn't play 1 week, so that means 3 weeks. He's been under 10 points. That's a tough stat to swallow. In New England, they on average only give up 12 points, 89 rushing yards, and they have not given up a rushing touchdown this year. Unless David Montgomery is going to run for 150 yards and catch the ball a few times, if he doesn't get in the end zone, it's going to be a really, really tough day. And not only just overall, they have not given up a touchdown to a running back on the ground, through the air. It's going to be tough sledding for David Montgomery. And honestly, if I was going to start a running back in that backfield, I'd almost want to start Khalil Herbert over him anyway. But I think it's going to be a tough week for David Montgomery, any of the running backs in Chicago. I would probably keep both of them on your bench. And then the receivers, we're going to go wildly obvious here. Ja'Marr Chase, CeeDee Lamb. Chase is going up against Atlanta. I just said start Joe Burrow in a smash play. Start Ja'Marr Chase in a smash play. He's coming off his 32-point wide receiver 1 performance. He has 22 targets in the last 2 weeks. The week before wasn't a huge game like this one, but 22 targets nonetheless. He's starting to get those targets up, and Atlanta has given up 3 30-point games to wide receivers. So he just came off a 30-point game. He had one in week 1. It's just a huge matchup for him as well as Joe Burrow. So I think both of those guys are really going to light up the scoreboard this week, and I think Ja'Marr Chase is going to start paying off for fantasy owners. And then CeeDee Lamb. I think Dak Prescott more than likely is going to be back this week. CeeDee Lamb's been getting the job done with Cooper Rush as a fantasy target, and he's going up against Detroit, who's 25th against the receiver position. So mix Dak Prescott being back with bad Detroit passing defense. It's a great recipe for CeeDee Lamb, and Lamb's averaging 10 targets a week. Detroit, they've given up 2 20-point games and a 30-point game to the wide receiver position, so it's feeding time, I think, for CeeDee Lamb coming back this week, or coming in this week with Dak Prescott coming back. Who are we sitting at the receiver position? Let's sit Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against Dallas, who is 19th against the receiver position. He's probably going to be shadowed by Diggs, or he's going to get double teamed. They're not dumb. They know who the top guy is for Detroit. And he's got 2 straight performances under 15 points. It's hard to move the ball on Dallas. So unless he gets 15 catches, it's going to be really tough for him to get fantasy points going, especially since I said sit Jared Goff as well. So tough game for those guys. And then I'm sitting Cortland Sutton going up against the Jets, who are 13th against the wide receiver position. The Jets have, last week, they shut down Green Bay, beat them, I think, 35-10. That's huge. And then, Denver, they're having a hard time moving the ball as is. Cortland Sutton last week was not part of any of them moving the ball down the field. He had single digits against the Chargers. He only has 1 touchdown this season. Hasn't had a 20-point performance. I think you're just starting to sell the Denver offense so far, and probably for most of the rest of the year. I think Cortland Sutton needs to stay on your bench this week going up against the Jets. Then at the tight end position, Gerald Everett. We're starting Gerald Everett going up against Seattle, who is 32nd against the tight end position. They give up an average of 17 points to the tight ends, and they've given up a 31 and 45-point performance, and they give up an average of 5 catches for 87 yards. Give Gerald Everett 5 catches for 87 yards. You're already putting him at 13 points. Throw a touchdown on top. It could be a huge week for Gerald Everett. And then at the tight end position for sitting, we're going to sit Robert Tonyan going against Washington. I know he's coming off a 19-point performance, tight end for day, but he was averaging 7.1 points before that. In Washington, they are sticklers against the tight ends. They've They only give up an average of 4 points, 2 catches, and 30 yards to tight ends. They've only given up 1 touchdown. It's going to be tough. And Green Bay, they're coming off those back-to-back losses. What are they going to look like morale-wise? They just gave up wins to the Giants and the Jets. I think it's going to be maybe not tough sledding for Green Bay. It could be, who knows. But I think Robert Tonyan, at the very least, struggles in that game. And now let's end it off with the love and hate for this week. Who are we loving at quarterback? Dak Prescott coming back against Detroit, who is 30th against quarterbacks. I think he's been ready the last 2 weeks. They've just been kind of trying to ride Cooper Rush. In Detroit, they've given up 2 20-point games, 2 30-point games, an average of 24.5 fantasy points. So I think Dak Prescott, I absolutely love this play this week. Huge comeback game for him, especially going up against a fairly weak defense. Who do we love at the running back position? We love Kenneth Walker going up against the Chargers, who are 32nd against running backs. He's coming off of a 19-point game, back-to-back weeks with a touchdown, so that's huge. He has had 23 touches and 110 yards last week. The Chargers, historically, this year are bad against running backs. They give up 22 points per game. They've given up 3 20-point performances, a 30-point performance. So it's going to be a really, really good day for Kenneth Walker. And I think he's got his 3rd straight week of being fantasy relevant coming up. Could possibly break the top 5 this week, as he only got to running back 8 last week. Who do we love at wide receiver? We love Tyreek Hill going up against Pittsburgh, who is 32nd against wide receivers. Believe Tua is going to be back this week off of his concussion. In the last full game that he had with Tua, he had 42 fantasy points. Huge game. He's averaging 22 points without Tua, so that's huge, and he had 29 last week. I mean, the guy's still getting the job done without Tua, and the last time he played with Tua, he put up almost 50. It's going to be a big game. And Pittsburgh, they give up an average of 31 points, 200 yards, and a touchdown to wide receivers. So I think you could probably throw Jalen Waddle in the mix too, and he's going to be just as good, maybe a little less good, or even better than Tyreek Hill. But I love Tyreek Hill as the guy this week for your receiver position. And then at the tight end position, we're going to go with David Njoku going against Baltimore, who's 18th against tight ends. They give up an average of 5 catches and a touchdown to the tight end position. Njoku, in half of his games, has 5 catches. So give him those 5 catches and give him a touchdown. You're already over 10 points. You're not even accounting the yards yet. So I think it's going to be a great week for David Njoku. And then who do we hate at quarterback? Zach Wilson going against Denver, who is 3rd against fantasy quarterbacks. Wilson has 19.1 total fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. His offense has scored 75 points in the last 2 weeks, and he isn't even averaging 10 points a week since coming back. That's tough. Honestly, throw Joe Flacco back in there. He was a better fantasy option than Zach Wilson has been, but they're scoring a lot of points. But going up against Denver, who just shut down Justin Herbert, who we all consider to be one of the top quarterbacks in fantasy, I don't think Zach Wilson has a chance this week, so keep him on the bench. Denver, they've only allowed 1 20-point performance, 3 single-digit performances, and 2 low 10 performances. And by low 10, I mean like 10 and 11. So it's not going to be a good week for Zach Wilson. DeAndre Swift, as much as I hate to say it, I have to have him on the hate list this week. Going up against Dallas, who is 4th against running backs. He's coming off an injury too. He's had pretty much 3 weeks to recoup, so maybe he is the one bright spot of the Detroit offense, but Dallas only allows 13 points. They've only allowed 2 top 15 running back performances, but on average, they give up the running back 22 performance. So If you don't mind DeAndre Swift having just a mediocre top 25 day, that's okay, but I think it's going to be really tough coming off the injuries, kind of being a little slow after 3 weeks out. Going up against Dallas, it's just not a good recipe, and I have to have him on the hate list this week. Mike Evans against Carolina. Carolina is 17th against the wide receiver position, but this really has nothing to do with even Carolina. This has to do with Mike Evans and the Tampa Bay offense. He only has 4 catches in the last 2 weeks, under 13 points in both those games. And Chris Godwin in the last 2 weeks has been outpacing him by a lot. And Mike Evans this year really only has 1 big game. So Chris Godwin starting to take over as the guy, and Mike Evans only having 1 big week. This week, I would rather start somebody else who has a chance of booming because first, this Tampa Bay offense is not humming, and if it is, it's starting to go through Chris Godwin. So I would have to have Mike Evans on the hate list here. And then for your tight end position, this one also hurts to say, but Zach Ertz going up against New Orleans, mostly just because D-Hop is back and he's going to steal a lot of those targets. And that's really my only concern. He doesn't have any weeks under 10 points, which is great consistency, but the Saints defense also give up an average of 3 points to the tight end position. So they're really good against tight ends. All but 1 week, they've given up under 5 points. So not only do I think New Orleans is a tough defense to go against, they're really tough against the tight ends, and D-Hop's going to be back. So I think Kyler Murray's going to want to make things happen, and he's going to start forcing it, I think, to DeAndre Hopkins. So all of it is just not great for Zach Ertz this week. That is it for today's show. Join tomorrow. We'll have Dylan Corbett on the show for Lucky Bets. We'll see how both of us did in DFS prop bets and get you some more for this next week. Get you all that betting advice. And then Thursday, tune in for the game day show. We'll get all the picks put in. We'll take a look at what happened last week and what to expect, what games to watch this week. But that's it for the fantasy show, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.